You want to make some picks on your favorite sports? Check out Underdog's fantasy pick'em game, where you can pick higher or lower on between 2 to 8 players and can win up to 325 times your entry by using code Niners when you sign up, and you'll get $1,000 bonus cash and a free pick.
From the alley-oops at Kezar to the glory days at the stick. From who's got it better than us to brick by brick. It's always the 49ers way, from off-season to game day. Yeah, we talk back. It's the 49ers Cutback.
It's 49ers Cutback podcast time. Welcome to the show, everyone. Time to talk about the 49ers' next defensive coordinator. And this isn't something that I've gotten into a whole bunch when I did shows with Mark Adams, the Red and Bolt show. When I was on with John Chapman, we did talk about the defensive coordinator. But for the most part, I've just given updates, not really my opinion on the whole thing. But it's getting more and more complicated as the days roll by. Right now, we know that Kyle Shanahan prefers Robert Saleh. I think the proof is in the pudding when you see the way that he's handling the process. And there's a lot of people that are very upset with the way he's handling the process. They don't like that he hasn't been interviewing everyone else, that he hasn't been trying to see what else is out there, that he's been pretty dead set that Robert Saleh is his guy. And so it's made for interesting conversation. It's made for an interesting dynamic because we're seeing these defensive coordinators that people were extremely high on slowly get hired by somebody else. When you see a name like Lou Anarumo, who a lot of people were very high on, who got fired from Cincinnati, he goes to Indianapolis, you're like, there was a missed opportunity. Or you see someone like Jeff Ulbrich, who is a former 49er, who worked under Robert Saleh in New York, and you see him get a job with the Atlanta Falcons, and Raheem Morris hired him there. And you're like, man, I thought we tried to request to talk to him last season. And I think it's always interesting when you see the dynamics, and there's a lot of people that get really upset with Kyle Shanahan for wanting to hire people that he's familiar with, because he definitely does do that. If they've had some sort of interaction in the past, it does help the process of him bringing them in. But we've seen him go outside a little bit before. When you think about a guy like Steve Wilks, who he hired in 2023, they didn't really have any interaction before. It was the availability of Steve Wilks that was very enticing. You had a head coach leave, or a defensive coordinator leave to become a head coach, and you needed to fill a role. And what were the options out there? And Steve Wilks was a good option at the time. He didn't feel Nick Sorensen was ready to be a defensive coordinator. And if you don't have that many options, you got to take the option that works for you. So in that case, he decided that he was going to go with Steve Wilks. We know now that that didn't work out. There wasn't that Steve Wilks wasn't a good defensive coordinator, and the 49ers didn't have defensive success. But when it came down to it, his scheme and the 49ers scheme and the way that they approached defense just didn't mesh entirely right. You're talking about a whole hoopla during the season of, are you going to be in the box or are you going to be on the field? And ultimately, that was a big change for Steve Wilks. It shouldn't matter if your defensive coordinator is on the field or in the box, but in this case, it did. So we're in a situation now where Robert Saleh is completely in limbo, and it's putting the 49ers defensive coordinator search in complete limbo. And as this thing progresses, more and more defensive coordinators fall off the board. So we're going to reassess what the defensive coordinator position looks like. I'm going to talk about special teams coordinator a little bit after this as well, but I want to take a deep dive into defensive coordinator and kind of set up where we're at and if there are more options that haven't been mentioned already, because I think there are still some guys out there the 49ers could turn to. And now a big name has been brought up that there's been internal talks, according to Tim Kawakami, about a really big former head coach. And you might have heard it already, but I want to talk to you about it a little bit in this episode. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. If you're listening audio platform, 49ers Cutback on Believe Network, please give it a 5-star rating. And if you're going to bet with Bet Online. Bet Online continues to be the world's most trusted betting platform, your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, Bet Online is your ultimate game day companion. With the largest selection of odds on everything from football, the NBA, college basketball, to NHL and UFC. Bet Online is the number one sports betting source for the new year. From touchdowns to three-pointers and hat tricks, Bet Online has you covered on every game, every play, and every win. Bet Online, the game starts here. So this is an interesting one when you're talking about defensive coordinator because the 49ers have to get it right. And Kyle Shanahan in his exit presser really discussed what he was looking for when it came to a defensive coordinator. He was looking for somebody that could help him rebuild the football team. That was very important, is he wanted somebody that's been a part of a build before. And it's not easy to find that guy consistently. Find a guy that can step in, and get it done for your football team. So the 49ers have been looking for somebody in this process, and they stumbled upon Robert Saleh. And it was interesting because I didn't think Robert Saleh was an actual option for the 49ers. I thought it was just people kind of putting that out in the ether that, hey, this would be wonderful if it happened, but can you really go home again? Robert Saleh really gets put on the map and becomes a head coach because of his time in San Francisco. Can you duplicate that again? And would Robert Saleh want to go back? What would that mean for him when the appearances to the outside world are what? What would he get out of if he turned the 49ers into a great defensive again? Would that catapult him up to being a potential head coaching candidate again? Well, we've seen in this cycle, he's still a head coaching candidate pretty much for several teams. I think he's interviewed like 4 or 5 times for several teams. And I mean, he should. He's a very good coach. But the thought of him coming back didn't seem realistic. And then all of a sudden, the 49ers announced that he had interviewed for the job. And as soon as that happened, I thought to myself, wow, this is actually possibly going to happen. And since then, there's been a lot of things that have changed. And Robert Saleh is not exactly as sure of a fit now than I thought he was a couple of weeks ago when they kind of announced that he had went ahead and interviewed for the 49ers job. So while this is going on, everyone is, expecting Kyle Shanahan to go out and interview several candidates: Dennis Allen, Lou Anarumo, Jeff Ulbrich, just to name a few. These are guys that people are interested in bringing to San Francisco because of their knowledge and because you can probably plug and put them in and they will have a top, 10 defense for you right away, depending on what they tell you. But also, you're expecting Kyle Shanahan to get information from these guys about how best to use his players, how best to, scheme it up, and so that way he can get some information. But what does Kyle Shanahan do? Kyle Shanahan interviews Deshae Townsend, he interviews Robert Saleh, and that's it. Nothing else has been announced. He said he was going to talk to Brandon Staley. That has not even been officially announced. So he basically interviewed 2 guys and then just stopped. Of course, now that he's interviewed those 2 guys, he can hire whenever he wants. It doesn't matter who it is. He can hire them now. He's done his job as far as the process. But did he do his job as far as the process is what everyone's wondering. Dennis Allen is going with Ben Johnson. Lou Anarumo went to the Indianapolis Colts. Jeff Ulbrich went to the Atlanta Falcons. And Robert Saleh has been going on these interviews and basically checking out all these other teams while the 49ers are kind of just sitting back and waiting for Robert Saleh to decide to come home. Then there's a report that the 49ers are willing to make Robert Saleh the highest paid defensive coordinator in the league. So the money's there. We just seen Cohen go back to Tampa Bay for more money. Would Robert Saleh, if the job is not quite right, come back to San Francisco? Well, Tim Kawakami thinks so. He still thinks that it's a really good possibility. I'm sorry, Michael Silver said he still expects Kyle Shanahan to reunite with Robert Saleh. So that's interesting that Michael Silver still believes Saleh is the guy, even with everything going on in Jacksonville. The interim GM, as Trent Baalke got fired, there's a lot of interesting things that come out of that. Now, what else comes out of it is the fact that there's a new player in the game, because everyone was starting to think it was Robert Saleh, and if Robert Saleh left, it was going to be Brandon Staley. Those were the two options that the 49ers were going to end up going with. And what are your feelings on Brandon Staley? Well, we'll talk about him in a minute, but a new candidate has kind of come into the mix, and it's Pete Carroll. And this has been reported by Tim Kawakami of the San Francisco Standard, and he says they've at least considered the possibility of hiring Pete Carroll as their defensive coordinator should Saleh secure one of the head coaching jobs that he's up for. Now, Pete Carroll is also a candidate for the Las Vegas Raiders job, and there's a question mark of whether he would accept this. Well, one thing I can tell you, and I got to give credit to my guy, Jay Hill. We do a show on Patreon, the Ant Hill Show. And on Monday morning, he said this. And I was kind of taken aback at the time. But now that the reports have come out about what Tim Kawakami said, I don't think it's that far-fetched. So listen to what Jay Hill said all the way on Monday. I want to give him his flowers for this comment about Pete Carroll.
If Saleh does go, and I read somewhere yesterday that this person might end up, or at least be a Tom Brady phone call to Vegas, but I'd call Pete Carroll. You're bringing that same kind of defense as Saleh. He's a San Francisco guy. He's a NorCal guy. He's a defensive coach. If you want somebody with energy, like in terms of just being able to go nonstop, like Carroll's a nut, and he's won the Super Bowl, so he knows how to get it done both as a head coach and as a coordinator. So that'd be my first phone call if Saleh does go Jacksonville.
Jay Hill was on to something, and he's not wrong. Pete Carroll would be an interesting candidate. Pete Carroll coached with the San Francisco 49ers in the 90s. He was defensive coordinator here. He has ties to it. Now, since then, a lot of things have changed. He became the big bad who annoyed everyone with his gum-chewing habits up in Seattle, and he was frustrating for the 49ers for a long time. But would the 49er fans, this is interesting, be willing to welcome Pete Carroll back? Well, I would, because Jay Hill's right. The energy level, the amount of energy that Pete Carroll puts into it, the attention to detail. One thing that he does really well is defense. And this is a guy that's been a CEO of a football team and won a Super Bowl. This is a great potential hire for Kyle Shanahan. The fact that they're even having internal talks about it is very cool, because Kyle Shanahan doesn't really have a direct pass with Pete Carroll. But what he does know is that Pete Carroll's one heck of a defensive coordinator and one heck of a coach. And Robert Saleh got his basis for what he does in his defense from Pete Carroll. It was Pete Carroll and Gus Bradley that built the Legion of Boom originally in Seattle. And Gus Bradley's another guy that's still out there available, and Kyle Shanahan has familiarity with him. So there could be a instance where Gus Bradley comes in, but I think for the most part, a lot of fans wouldn't really like that retread. He hasn't been very successful either as a head coach or as a defensive coordinator over the last several years. His mainstay was when he was with the Seattle Seahawks with the Legion of Boom, and everyone got really excited about what he was in that football game. With that football team. So I don't know if Gus Bradley's an actual option, but he is out there, and that's something to remember. It's not like everyone's leaving. The cupboard's completely bare. The 49ers have to get Saleh or Brandon Staley. But going back to Pete Carroll, you would not have to worry about the defense at all if you were Kyle Shanahan. You talk about a guy in Pete Carroll that's very adaptable, that understands your coverage schemes inside and out, that prepared to go against your offense, that could give you some real insight. Now, the question is Pete Carroll interested in coming to the 49ers? Well, that's an entirely different story. You tried to get Bill Belichick last year, and that's the one thing I can say about Kyle Shanahan. He's got guts. He's willing to make a phone call. If you think about the things that Kyle Shanahan's done in the years that he's been head coach, how about a few things that showed that he has intestinal fortitude? Number one, he calls Matt LaFleur and says, hey, are you guys trading Aaron Rodgers before the 2021 draft where the 49ers selected Trey Lance. And he got basically told off. And it kind of messed with their relationship a little bit. He's willing to ask. He was willing to sit down with Brock Purdy and say, hey, we're going to try to sign Tom Brady because you're hurt. And we think if he's the GOAT, if we could bring him in, he's going to be the starter. He called Bill Belichick last year and asked if Belichick was interested in being the 49ers defensive coordinator. And of course, he politely declined. So we know that Kyle Shanahan has the guts to call Pete Carroll and say, hey, what about moving south down to Northern California and joining the Empire? What do you think about becoming defensive coordinator? And most people would think, why would Pete Carroll do that? Well, there is the report that he is potentially in the mix for the Las Vegas Raiders job. And if the Raiders went that direction, it would make sense. This is a Super Bowl winning coach with a pedigree that's proven that he can turn around a program pretty quickly, especially if you get the right general manager and head coach combination. So he's definitely interested in still coaching. I think the way he was removed in Seattle was not the way he wanted his career to end. He wants to end on his own terms. So if he's not really a head coaching candidate in this cycle besides the Raiders, he might look to become an active coach again, be on people's radar. What a better way than to go to the 49ers, work with really good football players like Nick Bosa, Fred Warner, the guys that make plays on defense. You could come in. It's a similar scheme. There's adaptability there, I'm sure. Pete Carroll not only could adapt his own scheme, but he could adapt the 49ers to what he does, what he thinks would work, and all the while puts himself back in the mix. Because when he turns around the 49ers defense, which I believe he would, now around the league, he's going to be looked at as a viable option again in next year's coaching cycle. And somebody says, hey, Pete Carroll still got it. He's still viable. Yes, like Jay Hill said, this guy's a nut. He's an older guy, but he can keep going with energy. He's still got what it takes to coach our football team. So that would be why it could be an option for Pete Carroll. So he's just not sitting on the sidelines, but he's active in the NFL, and people are seeing him continue to coach well in the NFL. But it would be a bold move. Could you imagine what the people in Seattle would think of Pete Carroll coming to San Francisco? It was tough on them with Richard Sherman coming to the 49ers. How tough would it be if the symbol of their success in Seattle when it comes to Super Bowls and a head coach comes and becomes the 49ers defensive coordinator? It would be absolutely crazy. So Pete Carroll option, we don't know for sure. We do know the 49ers are potentially having internal talks about it. And I think it's a smart move. Now, Brandon Staley is still sitting there, and I don't know how people feel about Brandon Staley, but a lot of people, for the most part that I've heard, are not excited about that fact. And they're tying him to Nick Sorensen, which I think is a little unfair. Because even though his title was assistant head coach, defense, I don't think it was his job to intercede and take over for Nick Sorensen when things weren't going right. I think it was his job to give him support, talk to him about what was going on during games, and just kind of facilitate anything that he needed. So I don't want to tie what happened with Nick Sorensen this season, the 49ers struggles, and the ultimate firing of Nick Sorensen to Brandon Staley. I don't think that's fair. But let's look at the merits. What we do know is that Brandon Staley was a failed head coach in the league. They did not do a good job when he was with the Chargers. It was not a great defensive team, even though they had really good players, including Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Derwin James, lots of talented guys. But also, Staley was not the defensive coordinator. He hired a defensive coordinator. He became a CEO. He tried to allow others to call defense and allow the others to call offense, and he kind of just tried to handle it that way. Would he do that again? I doubt it. I bet he would want to call defense again. He would want to be active in these football games. But in 2020, and a lot of people kind of take a little bit of a shot at it, he had the number one defense with the Los Angeles Rams. And I get it. He had Aaron Donald, and he had a good unit there with the Rams, and they were one of the better teams in the league. But the fact that he did it, the fact that he produced a number one defense in this league, it proves that he can do it. Now, one of the interesting things was last year he interviewed for the defensive coordinator job, and Kyle Shanahan decided to give it to Nick Sorensen. Now, I don't know what that conversation was like with Brandon Staley to convince him to stay on in the role that he stayed, a more holistic view of the defense, just kind of helping Kyle on that side of the ball. Could it have been that, hey, if Nick Sorensen's successful in 2 years, he's going to be gone. You can take over a defensive coordinator if you don't get a head coach in the meantime. That could have been the conversation. But Brandon Staley, I think, is a good option. And I know that around the league, he's not getting any interviews. No one is knocking down the door to get Brandon Staley as their defensive coordinator. But Kyle Shanahan has had pretty good success when he's had the opportunity, the time, and the candidates to get it right. And I know that we've had a couple of failed candidates recently, but he knocked it out of the park with Robert Saleh. He knocked it out of the park with DeMeco Ryans. And so I'm hoping that he's going to land on the right guy. And I think he wants it to be Robert Saleh. But if it doesn't, and it falls through and it becomes Brandon Staley, I think one thing that was nice about the way that this was approached was Kyle Shanahan was able to allow Brandon Staley to learn this defense. They got to learn this defense over the last year. He got to learn the ins and outs and the way that the 49ers run the scheme, because Brandon Staley does not run the 49ers scheme. That's not something he did. But what he does do is come from a Vic Fangio style of defense. He coached with Vic Fangio in Chicago. He coached with him in Denver. And in fact, the reason that Sean McVay brought Brandon Staley in to be defensive coordinator is because of what the Patriots did to the Rams in the Super Bowl. So this will take you a little bit back, but during that season where the Rams went to the Super Bowl and they were basically running over everyone with Jared Goff at the helm, Vic Fangio during the season figured out how to stop their offense. He figured out how to take advantage of that 11 personnel and stop their running game, even though they were taking everyone out and running the ball at will. He figured out how to do it. Once that happened, Bill Belichick copied, pasted, Super Bowl, Rams get held to 3 points. And after that, Sean McVay was like, hey, I got to get someone in here who understands what Vic Fangio just did, because that's the wave of the future. And I got to figure out how also that I can overcome this defense, or people are just going to do this to me every time. So in comes Brandon Staley. And with it comes instant success. And the Vic Fangio scheme kind of went around the league. A lot of quarter schemes all of a sudden were around the league, and it was way more popular. And part of the reason was because of Sean McVay getting stopped in that Super Bowl and because of Vic Fangio. So when you've got a disciple like Brandon Staley of Vic Fangio, it makes sense. And a lot of fans wanted Vic Fangio as defensive coordinator, but he didn't want to change his scheme. So he went to Miami, where he didn't have to change his scheme. Now he's in Philadelphia, where he doesn't have to change his scheme. Kyle Shanahan has personnel, and he has a certain way that he wants things to go when it comes to the players for that personnel. He wants there can be adjustments, but for the most part, we don't want to turn the scheme completely over. We don't want to change the verbiage, because we have guys who are playing at elite level that already know everything, that feel comfortable in it. So now that Staley knows the verbiage, he's learned the scheme, he's learned the ideals of the defense, it gives him an opportunity, if he's tasked to step in and make something happen. So you've got three candidates still here in Pete Carroll, Brandon Staley, and Robert Saleh. I still think Robert Saleh is the one they ultimately want. If Robert Saleh does end up in Jacksonville, I think there's going to be a little bit of a frustration amongst 49er fans. And I think Twitter's going to blow up as the 49ers, they believe, missed out. And I think a lot of people are going to be very upset if it ends up being Brandon Staley. But I want to talk about a few more options potentially that the 49ers could go to when it comes to defensive coordinator. But before I do that, I need to talk to you guys about Underdog Fantasy. So Underdog Fantasy is something that I've really been getting involved in, and it's been a lot of fun. I've been playing the higher lower game. I played it last week for the wild card, and I'm going to play it again this week. And these are my picks. And what's cool about Underdog Fantasy is you can get money up to $1,000 and a free pick just by signing up. And you can sign up by clicking the link in the description, and using the promo code Niners, and then you can play along too. So they had a really good pack this week that I played, and it was to do with James Cook and Travis Kelce, which I really enjoyed. And so these are what I'm playing this week. You guys can do whatever you want, but I can win up to 9 times in this one. So I took a shot on these ones. Last week I did not win. Full disclosure here, but Saquon Barkley went off for me, which I really appreciate. But I had a lot of fun enjoying the games, and it definitely helped. I didn't have a team in the fight, but I had Underdog Fantasy to kind of get me through. And so I went higher with Brian Robinson getting 37.5 yards rushing in this game against the Eagles. And I think Brian Robinson is going to be relied on heavily. So I expect him to get over 40 yards, but he only has to get 38 in this football game. So higher on Brian Robinson. You'll see like a little bit of a way that I'm playing it. I went higher too with James Cook with 39.5, and I went higher with Travis Kelce with 5.5 receptions. So he needs to get 6, and of course James Cook needs to get 40 yards. Now that was a pack, and it's a promo pack, so you can get that. It's a 2-for-1. Go check that out. I enjoyed that. They also have one if you want to play Patrick Mahomes 0.5 yards for a promo. That's an instant win. You win automatically if you play that one. So I thought I'd throw that out there for you. And then I got Harrison Butker with 1.5 field goals made. So you put 25 on it, you can win $250 in this one if you just played the picks that I play. But you are free to play whatever picks you want in Underdog's higher, lower game. It's a lot of fun. And if you're interested in fantasy, go ahead and check that out. And it's a lot of fun. Use the promo code Niners. Click the link in the description section and get signed up and get playing. If you already have Underdog, well, hey, get playing. It's a lot of fun and really enjoying it. So a couple more options for defensive coordinator that I want to put out there. Number 1 is Matt Eberflus. Eberflus was the Chicago Bears head coach. And I think this is one thing we've seen with some defensive coordinators around the league is they're really good coordinators and maybe not the best head coaches. I think you put Dennis Allen in that. I think you put Matt Eberflus in that. But they're looking for other opportunities. And you look at Spagnuolo in Kansas City, a failed head coach who is probably the best defensive coordinator in the league right now. So does it always work out as a head coach? No. But that doesn't signify that you're not a good defensive mind. So Eberflus is still a name that I like out there. I brought up Gus Bradley as well. I think that's another potential option for the 49ers. So I think there's still good defensive coordinators out there. That's one of the good things about this process and the 49ers being able to start so early is there are still a lot of candidates available. It's not February. It's not after the Super Bowl and everything is picked over and you're trying to decide between, a couple of guys, an internal candidate and one guy on the outside, and you just pick the best one. This time you actually have some more options, and nothing has been figured out because there's still head coaching vacancies out there. What those head coaching vacancies means, some of the defensive coordinators are going to stay available, and what you're hoping is you're going to get a decision on Robert Saleh one way or the other. And I think at some point, I think this whole thing with Jacksonville's got to work out, and then once it does, I expect Kyle Shanahan to move quickly. If Robert Saleh accepts the Jacksonville job, I think Kyle Shanahan will move very quickly to secure his defensive coordinator, whether that's the in-house candidate in Brandon Staley, a guy that maybe is a possibility like Pete Carroll, or a Matt Eberflus or somebody else that he's targeting out there. I think that he will move quickly with that. Now, the ultimate hope for the 49ers is that Robert Saleh is going to decide to come back to San Francisco. It's the perfect marriage of we already know what you can do. You already fit our system. Our players are going to respond to you. And we've built it before. We can build it again. And you're going to be the highest paid defensive coordinator in the league. I can't say that I think that that is the most likely outcome, just because I think Robert Saleh is a tremendous candidate. And I think any team would be lucky to have him. The way that he goes about business is the way you're supposed to. But I would say to Robert Saleh, make sure the situation you go to is something that's going to help you be a successful head coach. Because if it's not, you could potentially become one of these guys that they feel is a failed head coaching candidate. You might never get another opportunity to do so. So Trent Baalke being out is going to help. If you get to pick your general manager there in Jacksonville, That will really work. And then I think he could be potentially on his way out. Now, I did want to talk just for a second about the special teams because I do think it's getting down to the 49ers deciding. And there's been a report from Mike Silver, and he said it's not going to be Nick Sorensen. And I think that that's probably what most people want. We don't even know if Nick Sorensen is officially going to stay with the 49ers organization as a coach in general. But I think the 49ers have honed in on somebody that they really want. Now, Chris Banjo had interviewed. He's gone at this point, but they still have a plethora of candidates that they could go to. But I do believe that the 49ers will eventually, and this is my own belief, but reading the tea leaves, I do believe the 49ers are going to eventually hire, as special teams coordinator, Chris Tabor. He was with the Carolina Panthers. He was their interim head coach this season. And I think that there is a connection between him and Kyle Shanahan from their time in Cleveland in 2014. So Kyle's seen him operate. He's seen him run a special teams. And this is a guy that's well-respected around the league, who's been around and ran a lot of special teams units. And I think this is exactly what Kyle Shanahan is looking for. And so I do believe that Tabor will be the guy that he ends up tapping for that football special teams head coach or a special teams coordinator job. Almost called special teams head coach, but special teams coordinator job. So I think that that's going to happen, and they're going to get this thing figured out. So where defensive coordinator is a little bit more up in the air, I think special teams coordinator is going to get figured out here pretty soon. My favorite candidate, of course, John Fossil, went to Tennessee, so that's not going to happen. And, we'll see what happens for the 49ers. And an outside-the-box candidate that I thought of, and I'm just going to throw it out there, I don't know if it's an actual possibility, but if I was Kyle Shanahan, I would call Robbie Gould. And you might say, what? Robbie Gould, he's a kicker. He was a kicker for the 49ers. Well, he also has been a coach. He's been coaching for a little while. But one of the things that I remember them talking about is Robbie Gould understanding everything about the special teams, and he would also understand the offense and the defense. He made a point to be a really good football mind. And if you need somebody to work with Jake Moody, this might be the guy to do it. He understands the technique it takes to be a kicker. If you're Kyle Shanahan and you're John Lynch and you don't understand the kicker technique, and I don't understand kicking technique, I was never a special teams guru when it came to the kicker, then you could get somebody that can. And I'm not saying maybe Chris Tabor can, but I think that's one of the points of emphasis, right? Is somebody that can either fix Jake Moody or tell you Jake Moody doesn't have it so you can move on. And Robbie Gould would be a perfect candidate. Now, I don't know if he'd be willing to move off his head coaching jobs that he's doing as far as high school, but what an opportunity it would be for the 49ers. And I think Robbie Gould would do a very tremendous job. Just thought I would throw that out there as a little tidbit, an outside-the-box potential candidate that I would love to see the 49ers entertain because of his specialty when it comes to kicking. He could make sure that was right, and he's also a very good football mind. So just something to throw out there as I end the episode. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I really appreciate it. For listening audio platform, 49ers Cutback on Believe Network. Please give it a 5-star rating. And of course, this episode is brought to you by Bet Online. The game starts here. Try Underdog Fantasy. Click the link in the description. But everyone have a good one. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Until then, stay safe. Remember, the right way is always the 49ers way.